What happens when you betray Pablo Escobar? Escobar was a tough person to betray. Not many can deny that. After all, he was the biggest, most dangerous drug cartel leader in the 1980s. Half the people loved him, half of them hated him. But all of them, to a certain extent, were absolutely terrified of him. So imagine the amount of guts and nerve it would take to first earn his trust, which was a near impossible task in itself, and then lose it all. But don't let that make you think that some people didn't try to sell his secrets. Of course, they did. It's a pretty irresistible trade. It's just that very few of them lived to tell the tale. Escobar and his personal life. Oh, but the people that were watching had quite a few stories to tell, like the one about one of the servants that worked for Escobar. According to some sources, one time he discovered one of his servants stealing his silverware. For a man as wealthy as him, you would think this might not be that big of a deal. But Escobar is Escobar, and all he needed was really an excuse to do terrible things. So what he did was that he tied the servant and drowned him in his pool while his guests watched. All for a couple of plates that he never really cared for in the first place. He always wanted people working under him to be so deeply loyal and faithful that they wouldn't even think about doing some petty thefts. And have you ever wondered how he reacted to his ex-girlfriends finally finding happiness after him? One time, Escobar was with his mistress, Virginia Vallejo, a journalist whom he for a short time fell in love with. While they were sitting around, he told her that one time he found out one of his ex-girlfriends got pregnant by another man. For him, it was a deep betrayal, even though they had already gone their separate ways several years ago. So, he ordered his men to force her into the car, take her to the hospital, and force her to get an abortion. Vallejo said that she was deeply disturbed by this. From then on, the thought of being close to Escobar made her skin crawl. Pretty understandable. So now you probably have some idea of the kind of man we're dealing with here. Deep paranoia and a tendency for extreme cruelty make for a deadly combination. Escobar was the kind of person who would even consider the smallest of mistakes as a personal betrayal. This is something that forced every single person around him, no matter how much they claimed to be Escobar's friend, to walk on eggshells when they were around him. You need to understand that Escobar was a deeply distrustful person, and how could he not be? No one really climbs the heights he managed to do as a notorious drug lord without making some powerful enemies along the way. And Vallejo remembers even more accounts of his dangers and terrifying paranoia. In her book, Loving Pablo, Hating Escobar, Vallejo recalls an incident that deeply petrified her. Once, the two lovers were laying in bed together speaking of pretty much sweet nothings. This was during the last couple of years of Escobar's life when all his men either betrayed him or began dropping like flies. It had been clearly troubling him for a while because, without a warning, Escobar's tone suddenly changed. He turned to her and said very slowly and very carefully that if she tried to betray him, she would wind up dead. And don't think this was limited to his side flings. While he was on the run in the last years of his life, he would have his children blindfolded every time they shifted houses. This wasn't for their protection. It was a precaution that if they were caught and tortured, they wouldn't be able to disclose Escobar's location. Escobar in his business life. And, of course, if he was this distrustful of the people closest to him, everyone in his business saw a version of Escobar that was 100 times worse. He was so paranoid that someone would bring down the empire that he controlled every single one of Medellin cartel's operations. Not a single decision was made without heavy involvement from the king of cocaine himself. Sure, he may have delegated some tasks to his accomplices, but it was only after years of them earning his trust. Even then, Escobar kept a pretty strict watch on them. He would change bodyguards daily and hire new messengers to take his messages. Very rarely would he himself have a meeting with you, unless it was a coincidence or you were about to get killed. In fact, the sicarios hired under him never knew that it was Pablo Escobar that hired them. They were only really concerned about getting paid. This was so that if the sicarios were ever caught and interrogated, they couldn't betray information. Here's another story about Escobar being extremely secretive. When he reached an agreement with the Colombian government to stay in prison, and in exchange for this, the government promised not to extradite him to the US, he built his own prison, La Catedral. It wasn't really much of a prison. This place was a castle. It was like a huge, never-ending bachelor party. Swimming pools, saunas, nightclubs, it had it all. But what it also had was an enormous amount of privacy. Not a single member of the Colombian police or the army was allowed to enter the compound. On his way to La Catedral, he was to be picked up from a secret location and flown to the place. While he was in the air, no other plane in Colombia was allowed to fly. Sure, Escobar had the ability to be extremely friendly and charismatic. This was what brought his men to him. But what kept them loyal to Escobar was fear. They feared that if they chose to leave his side and run off to a rival cartel, they may just be killed. In fact, this fear was something implied in the memoir published by Escobar's son, Juan Pablo Escobar, called Escobar, My Father. According to the memoir, one time, Escobar asked one of his lackeys, El Gordo, to bring him coffee. He popped an Alka-Seltzer in his mouth while no one was watching, and so when he took a sip of that coffee, his mouth started to foam. He then proceeded to accuse El Gordo of poisoning his cup. And, would you believe it, Escobar ordered his men to tie up El Gordo and pointed a machine gun at him while he begged for his life. Of course, once the other men realized that Escobar was just joking around, they had to play along. But deep down, it made them deeply uneasy. If Escobar was this cruel for a joke, who knew what limits he would cross if someone actually dared to poison him? Escobar was also deeply suspicious of phone calls. In fact, his son, Juan Pablo, in an interview, talked about how his father always instructed him to steer clear of phone calls. They were too easily traced, too easily recorded. And if you were one of the most wanted men in the country, with 3 different groups chasing their tails and trying to track you down, phone calls were a fool's mistake. So, what would Escobar do? He hired men to talk on phones all day to throw off anyone who might be tracing and secretly listening in to their conversations. For Escobar, stealing from him pretty much counted as a betrayal, as you probably now know. So, let me tell you another story about what happened if you stole from Pablo Escobar. One time, an electrician working for Escobar stated that once, one of the people working under him sold drugs produced by the Medellin cartel behind Escobar's back and kept the money. It wasn't enough to get Escobar suspicious, but just enough to line his pockets with a little extra cash. When Escobar found out, he was so furious that he, along with his men, dropped him from a helicopter. But they were just given very specific orders. They had to drop him from a point not high enough to kill him, but just high enough to break his legs. And once that was done, Escobar ordered his men to ride motorcycles over him until the poor man died. It always helped that, rather than doing it all on his own, he asked his men to punish him so that they, too, would ponder about what might happen if it was someone else doing it to them. There was even an interview in 2000 with Jorge Ochoa, who was one of the key players in the Medellin cartel in the 1979s, before he agreed to hand himself over to the Colombian authorities in 1991. He had quite a few things to say about Escobar's very distrustful personality. He never consulted anyone while making a decision. If someone was too insistent with their opinions, they would get killed, even if they were close friends with Escobar. And if you wanted to voice your disagreements with him, no, forget about it. It would end up with you 6 feet under and Escobar doing whatever he wanted to do. In fact, he even killed Ochoa's brother-in-law. What do you believe Ochoa must have done? Complained to Escobar? Voiced his anger? Perhaps he would have thrown a fit. No. In fact, Ochoa said nothing. Partly because he was in prison in Spain when that happened, and partly because he feared that he might also be forced down the same path if he dared to cross Escobar. And one person would know that better than anyone else. Carlos Ladar. Ladar was one of Escobar's closest associates in the Medellin cartel. At one party, hosted by Escobar, one of his men knocked on the door. Carlos, who was sitting beside Escobar, pulled out a gun and shot the man behind the door. He turned to Escobar, apologized, and the party continued. At that moment, Escobar said nothing. But the next day, he lured Ladar to a secret location and then led the U.S. authorities to that hiding place to arrest Ladar. Just like that, one of Escobar's closest men became as expendable as any guy on the street. So this is what happens if you betrayed Pablo Escobar. In a nutshell, you would have been discarded, or if he was feeling in the mood for torture, he would have had you begging for death. It makes you really think, doesn't it? Thank you for watching this video, and we hope to see you in the next one. Until then, goodbye.